if you ask me, is there one thing that the world's most advanced education systems have in common? And yes, there is, and it's the capacity of teachers in schools and countries to look outwards. The capacity and willingness of teachers to look what's happening in the next classroom. The willingness of schools to see what's happening in the next school, and the willingness of countries to understand what's happening in other places, even if they may follow different ideas and different cultures. And the world is changing fast, and it is so much easier to educate children for our past than for their future. It's really, really hard. And as parents, sometimes we are part of the problem, not part of the solution. You know, we get very anxious when our children no longer learn things that were so important for us. No? Or we get even more nervous when our children learn things that we don't understand. No? We're trying to keep things back. As teachers, we're more likely to teach how we were taught than how we were taught to teach. And as a politician, you can lose an election over education, but you never win an election over education. Because it takes so much time to translate good ideas into better results. But again, the world is changing amazingly fast. You know, think about 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago, we got those little devices, smartphones, into our hands. It brought the world's knowledge right at our fingertips. And a few years later, the virtual world and the real world began to merge, to integrate. And suddenly everybody was connected. And that looked so great, but some of these things that used to be really simple became very complicated. When you think, for example, of literacy. Teaching reading was really easy in the past. It was about teaching people to read what's written in a book. And when your students didn't know the answer to a question, you could ask them, well, look it up in an encyclopedia. And you can trust the answer to be true. Today, your students look up their questions on Google and they find 30,000 answers to their question, and nobody tells them what's right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge, it's about constructing knowledge. It's about navigating ambiguity. It's about developing a reliable compass and navigation skills to find your own way, a very, very different construct. And I just said, you know, everybody got connected, how great. No? We can talk to anyone. But actually, if you look what actually happens, you students and we as adults, we talk to people who are like us, who look like us, who think like us. It's actually much harder for young people today to encounter the diversity of societies than it used to be for us. We forget that sometimes. School has a very, very important mission these days to actually create those kinds of experiences of diversity. And when you look about technology, half of young people, according to PISA, say they feel really, really bad if they're not connected. Now, being connected has become like drinking water and breathing air for people. And if you look just at 3 years between 2012 and 2015, the time that students spend online has almost doubled in Italy and in many other countries as well. No? The virtual world is becoming the real world. And if you actually think what this means for the future of education, digitalization is changing everything. No? It's incredibly democratizing. Everybody can participate, everybody can collaborate through digital technology. But it's also concentrating power at a rate that we have never seen before. It's incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard everywhere. Now, you post something on Twitter and everybody in the world can know. But it's also incredibly homogenizing, squashing individuality, cultural uniqueness. Everything becomes the same. Digitalization is incredibly empowering. If you ask yourself, you know, the biggest companies that are created these days have started with an idea, not with a big factory. The Googles, the Facebooks, Tencents. They had the product before they had the money. Everybody can now change the world, for better or worse. It wasn't like this before, but also technology can be incredibly disempowering. We often become the slaves of algorithms these days. We trust our GPS more than we trust our sense of orientation, and our fitness watch more than our sense of the health of our bodies. Those are the sides, and where you end up on this has a lot to do with the knowledge and skills of people. And we see the same at the workplace. Workplaces are changing. One of the things that is very clear is that routine cognitive skills are disappearing very rapidly. Now, the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, they've become easy to digitize, to automate. The kind of things in schools that we know how to do best are losing most quickly their relevance. And at the same time, technology-rich tasks are rising in workplace. You put those things together and you can see how the workplace is changing. And if you want to see some data to this, the skills that are rising or that are declining fastest are not manual skills. They are routine cognitive skills. The skills that are increasing in relevance in our societies are our capacity to solve complex problems, our capacity to think imaginatively, and most importantly, look at the green line, our social skills. The one thing I disagree with you, Ludovico, is to call those things soft skills. There's nothing soft in those skills. Actually, if I think about soft skills, I think about things like science or mathematics. I'm a good example. I studied physics. I learned a lot of things in physics. If you put me in a laboratory today, those skills have evaporated because the field of science is changing very rapidly. The kind of things that we used to talk about hard skills are the ones that are most elusive, that are disappearing they're losing relevance. The kind of things that actually remain in us and that grow in relevance are things like character, our capacity to think autonomously, think for ourselves, to work with others. And you can see that in the data. This is not just in life. That is also at the workplace. Huge changes. And it's easy to talk about it, hard to do in classrooms. I give you an example. Everybody talks about social skills, collaborative skills. We tested them in PISA. Easy to talk about. But then what do we do in schools? We put students behind individual desks, and at the end of the year, we give them a test to show that they are better than the neighbor. That's not the way you develop social skills. So there's a big contradiction between the learning environments that we have and the skills that we need for the world of tomorrow. Some people have called this a race between technology and education. Before the great industrial revolution, neither technology nor education were really important for the vast majority of people. But then came the first industrial revolution, moving technology ahead of the people. And lots of people were left very badly behind. But those were the years when we invented universal public schooling, moving people ahead of the technologies of those times, making people compliant with the norms of the industrial age in society. And it generated huge amounts of prosperity. But today we see the digital revolution that does exactly this again. Moving technology ahead of people and creating huge amount of social pain. You have lots of people with a university degree finding difficulties finding a job, and at the same time employers tell you they cannot find the people with the skills they need. There's again this growing wedge between what our societies need and what our education systems produce. And the question is really, how do we move ahead against this? And I want to just show you some thinking that we have at the OECD about this. And what is it going to take to be successful in tomorrow's world? Knowledge, obviously, is always very important. But even the type of knowledge changes very rapidly. Content knowledge loses rapidly in value. What's gaining in value is your capacity not to know a lot about physics and chemistry and biology, but your capacity to think like a scientist. Can you design an experiment? Do you understand which questions are scientifically investigable and which are not? your capacity to think like an historian. History has actually very little to do with names and places and people and so on. It has to do with understanding how the narrative of a society emerges, develops, grows, advances, and sometimes unravels when the context changes, and what that means for the times in which we live today. Our capacity to think like a mathematician. Understanding, not being able to calculate an exponential function, but understanding its meaning. And if we would have done better with this, if we would understand the nature of an exponential function, and we would have sent probably 3,000 people to fight the crisis of Ebola in Africa, not 300. We often know the formulas, but don't understand the meaning. Teaching fewer things at greater depth. That's really the knowledge of the future. If we cannot think like a scientist, then Google will be useless to us. But what is clear is that the modern world no longer rewards us just for what we know. Google knows everything. The modern world rewards us for what we can do with what we know. Our deep understanding of the foundations of the disciplines and our capacity to think across the boundaries of disciplines. That's the key for tomorrow. But again, knowledge is only one part of the story. The other part has to do with skills, our capacity. And when you think about skills, the first thing you talk about often is cognitive skills. Curiosity, critical thinking, creative thinking are very important. But once again, the skills with the most rapid rise in demand are social skills, emotional skills, courage, curiosity, leadership, empathy. Our capacity to work with people who are different from us, who think differently from us. I know yesterday my colleague Mario Piacentini, who leads our work on global competency, talked about it. That's the currency of our times. Embracing diversity in thinking. Connecting the dots where the next innovation, the next big idea is going to come from. That's the skill of the future. And then, last but not least, we often delegate that to families, outside the schooling. It's about values. It's about foundations. And there have been huge transformations in some countries around the world. Now, we try to build our school systems around academic disciplines because we have done that for hundreds of years. Actually, there are now some education systems that are putting that into question, that put at the center of education certain values, and they build the disciplines around them. If you are a sports teacher in Singapore, for example, it's not about just making students more athletic. Every day you have to ask yourself, does our education system, our sports teaching, contribute to teaching young people responsibility for themselves, take responsibility for others, develop courage, develop leadership skills? Values at the heart of education. If people don't feel values or feel a floor under their feet, they're going to build walls around them. In a fast-changing world, if you can't find orientation for yourself, it's actually increasingly harder for people to build that. That's what we call competency at the OECD. Our capacity to mobilize our cognitive, social, and emotional resources, to integrate them, to do something. If you think about what are those key competencies that are important today, the first thing is obvious. What distinguishes us most from computers is our capacity to think imaginatively, to think laterally. Artificial intelligence is very, very powerful to use data to predict the future from those data. What humans can do is question those data. Think laterally, think beyond the boundaries, think around the next curve. Creating something of intrinsic positive worth, a very, very important foundation of the competency. Our capacity to deal with tensions and dilemmas. Now, the world is no longer black and white, good and bad. Actually, students need to be able to navigate ambiguity. And they need to take responsibility. That's why we put student agency at the heart of our framework. And that has a lot of implications. In much of education, we treat students as passive learners. The test of truth for today is actually, do we develop active learners? And this has to do, when you look at the pedagogical models for this, being open to the novelty. It's very easy to teach students the established wisdom of our times, what we know. But what's more important today is to teach young people to question the established wisdom of our times, to see the novelty, to be open for the new. It's actually quite easy to learn. What is much harder often is to unlearn and relearn, to put into question the habits, the ideas that we've got very familiar with when the context changes, to be open to the novelty. Second, to be able to step back, to see the bigger picture, to see the forest among the trees. We are flooded with information. Do we understand the meaning, the structures, the ideas behind them, the foundations? Very, very important. And then again, taking action. And now, I've talked a lot about it, but how do we actually do? I want to show you a country that we always admire in our international comparisons. Canada is a country that has always great scores on the PISA test. And it's a very, very good education system. Highly performing and very equitable. And you can see, in the Canadians, for example, they put a lot of effort on critical thinking, which you need to do well. And they do that not only as a subject, you can see this in the mathematics lesson, the science lesson, the history lesson. Throughout the curriculum, critical thinking is very, very important. They also put emphasis on communication, on problem solving. But then you look, for example, at collaboration, social skills. You don't see any bar. I'm not saying that Canadian teachers are not teaching their young people to be social, but it's not part of the instructional system. It's not what school claims to be about. Let me show you another education system that is doing really well on international comparison, Japan. One of the most incredible kind of performers on international comparison. But remember, the Canadians were doing really well on critical thinking. The bar is quite short in the case of Japan. They're not as good on those kinds of things. But look at social skills. The Canadians were not so good on this, and the Japanese put a lot of emphasis on social skills. In fact, that was very interesting for us when we tested social skills in PISA. We had China and Japan, similar cultures, similar ideas in education. They do very well in individual problem solving. You give them tasks to solve problems individually. But when we tested social problem solving in a team, the Japanese did even better, and the Chinese did quite poorly. Chinese are very competitive education systems. Japan is a very collaborative education system. Students always work together in a team. They cook the meal together with the teacher. The stronger students help the weaker students. It's a system built around collaboration. You can see it in the results. So even the most advanced education systems have a lot of things to learn. You can look at the end of the slide, entrepreneurship. Very important in the world of today. Successful education system like Japan doesn't put much of a premium on those kinds of 21st century skills. So even the most advanced education system have a lot of work to do to basically build the education system. Now I want to talk a little bit about some of the kind of things that we can do to advance our school systems. And before I do this, I want to actually talk through some of the myths that often prevent us from moving forward. One of the things that we are really good at in education is to create ideas, theories that prevent us from becoming better, from advancing, or even from looking outward. We say, well, these people are different from us, that's why we can't learn from them, and so on. Actually, once you actually study this, you see some of these things are actually not true. The first thing that we often say is that poverty is destiny. If students come from a disadvantaged social background, that's not so much education can do about this. Inclusion is a nice idea, but it's not possible to deliver on this. This is one of the most interesting slides that came out from the PISA comparison, because here I compare apples with apples. The red dot at the bottom of the bars is the performance of the students from the most disadvantaged families internationally. Those students all have the same kind of social background, but you can see they perform very differently. You can see that the 10% most disadvantaged students in Vietnam, for example, can still compare themselves with the average students in Italy. And they are doing better than many of the wealthiest students in South America. Poverty is not destiny. So what does Vietnam do to educate its poorest students so well? Is this about culture? No, it's actually about what they do. It's about policies. No? They're very, very good in attracting the most talented teachers in the most challenging classrooms. No? And the principals as well. If you're a school principal in Vietnam in one of the best performing schools, or vice principal, and you want to become a principal, move up in your career, the only way you can do that is become the principal of one of the poorest schools. No? And show that you can change it. No? And the same for the teacher. And that's why it is most attractive for teachers to work in the most difficult schools, and that's why disadvantaged students have better results. It's a very simple recipe. If you're a high-performing school in Vietnam, they are going to give you more money. Same in China. And you can actually hire more experts, more resources, more teachers. But the trick is you cannot use those people in your own school. You can use those people only to support a lower performing school. If you give a lower performing school more money, maybe they don't spend it so well. But now they get the best teachers, the brightest people, to help them to work with them. Simple recipe showing us that poverty need not be destiny. This next thing that we often think is about, oh, if we get more immigrants, they will drag the performance of education systems down. Well, actually we tested that. The country where immigrants come from clearly makes a difference. No question about it. But the country where immigrants go to school has a 3 to 4 times as much of an impact as the country where they come from. Sometimes students with the same background, country of origin, depending in the system where they go to school, their results can be hugely different. That's why at the OECD, we don't see any relationship between the overall performance of an education and the share of students with an immigrant background. None. Even after controlling for country of origin and social background and so on. Is our capacity of the education systems to be truly inclusive that really makes the difference. The next thing becomes more controversial. Some people think it's all about money, but actually if you look at this in more detail, you can see money makes a difference, but only up to a point. Actually, and in Italy, you can make a good argument for investing more in education. I wish Italy would take education more seriously, put more resources into this. But, actually how you invest the money is equally important. You're not, as a country on the left side of this. It's the same with time. There are huge differences in the amount of time that students spend learning in school. Look at this. In blue, I show you the time that students spend learning in school, and in yellow, I show you the time that students spend in extracurricular activities or learning at homework, all sorts of things. And look at this. In the United Arab Emirates, here, students spend almost 60 hours learning. More than adults would be allowed to work. If I look to Finland, it's just a little bit more than half than that. Huge difference in the volume of learning time across countries. And actually, if you look to Italy, school days are not short here. Learning hours are not little. Students spend quite a bit of time learning. But when you ask about productivity in the education, how actually do students learn per hour of instruction? You can see that in Finland or Germany or Switzerland or Japan, students learn a lot in very little time. Whereas in the United Arab Emirates, they spend a lot of time and learn very little. So again, it's not so simple just adding more time to the system. It's how we use the most precious resource in education. And that's not money, that's student learning time. That's really about quality of teaching. And let me focus on this in a little bit more detail. This is another way of looking at resources. On the vertical axis, I show you the ratio of students to teachers. The lower you are, the more generous your education system is. And on the horizontal axis, I show you the size of classes. You can see there are huge differences across countries. I'm comparing 2 countries here. One is the United States, and one is China. The 2 biggest economies for which we have data. And you can see they are both quite generous and having lots of teachers for every student, for every 100 students. very similar in this. But they are very different in the size of classes. In China, the classes are very large. In the United States, the classes are very small. And now you might think, well, you know, the Americans are much smarter. They have lots of more teachers, and they use the teachers to make classes smaller. But think about it carefully. You can only spend your money once. No? If you make the classes small, you cannot pay your teachers well. And you cannot give your teachers time to do other things than teaching. The Chinese teachers teach less than half the hours of the American teachers. They teach between 11 and 16 hours per week. But they actually work more than the American teachers. So what do they do in their remaining time? Well, they watch what other teachers do. They observe other teachers' lessons. They take a lot of effort to do collaborative research and professional development. 240 hours per year. A big investment in advancing their careers. They spend a lot of time with individual students. They spend a lot of time with parents. So, and again, you know, the small class is a little bit of a trap. It uses a lot of resources that we don't have for other things. Now, I don't show you the flag for Italy because Italy is a sort of special case. You're the only country that succeeds to have actually lots of teachers and still big classes. But, but the trade-off is very, very important. Now you will tell me, well, smaller classes may not be so effective, but actually smaller classes are what teachers like. No? We tested that. We asked teachers, you know, what makes them happy in their class, in their work. And actually, the size of the class was not something that distinguished teachers' job satisfaction. And now you ask me, then, you know, if it's not the size of the class and the salary, what makes teachers happy? And the answer was very clear. And it was very similar across countries. The single most important predictor of teacher job satisfaction is the degree of professionalism in the education system. What do I mean by this? Three things. First is the knowledge that teachers have. No? Knowledge about the subject they teach, obviously. Knowledge about how students learn. And knowledge about their students. No? Do teachers actually know each of their students? No? Makes a huge difference in terms of disciplinary climate and so on. But knowledge is just the starting point. The second dimension was what we call professional autonomy. What discretion do teachers have to design innovative learning environments, to build professional instructional practice? And professional autonomy is not about I do what I like to do. Professional autonomy is I do what I know is the right thing to do in the name of my profession. You know, if you are a pilot in a plane, no? And they teach you to land against the wind, no? And if one day you would go and announce to your passengers, hey, well, I have a new idea, you know, I want to land with the wind, you know, we're going to see how this is going to work out. No? That's what pilots wouldn't do, no? But we do that often in the classroom. No? We try out things. No? We don't experiment systematically. Professional autonomy is really about being part of a community. And that brings me to the third aspect that is also very important, the collaborative culture. You take those three things together, that's what predicts satisfaction with the job, satisfaction with the work, self-efficacy, the belief, the trust of teachers in their own abilities, and also the status of the teaching profession. Very interesting. And actually, when you look at this in more detail, you can see that in a moment. So, having talked about some of the things that actually we often see as barriers in education, let's have a look at some of the solutions. And I'm going through them quite carefully. The first big difference among high and less well-performing education systems is the value they place on education. Of course, you know, everybody talks about how important education is, but, you know, the test comes to the truth when you ask yourself, you know, would you want your child to be a teacher or a lawyer, you know, or, you know, how well do we pay our teachers? No. All of those are signals of the value of the profession. No. And we have tested that in the OECD. When you actually look at this, you can see in countries like Singapore or Korea or Finland, teachers perceive themselves as a highly valued profession. Everybody wants to become a teacher. No? Teacher salaries in Finland or Singapore are good, but not great. No? But still, everybody wants to become a teacher, not because it's financially attractive, but because it's intellectually attractive and a rewarding environment for people to work in. No? If I look, that country where my children go to school in France, only 5 in 100 teachers believe their profession is valued by society. And now you can tell me, well, that's just, the idea of teachers doesn't really matter. But actually, you correlate this with the learning outcomes, and you can see the value placed on teachers is one of the most important predictors of the performance on international tests. The causal nature, we don't know. Maybe it's where teachers are great, society values them. Maybe it's where society values teachers, everybody wants to become a teacher, and the best people actually do great work. We do not know. But the fact is, the value society places on education is a big differentiator. Chinese parents and grandparents are going to invest their last time, their last resources into the education of their children, the future of their country. In Europe, we have already spent the money of our children for our own consumption, and that's why we have all these mountains of debt everywhere. And so this is a big signal, the value society places on education. The next thing, sounds very simple, very hard to do, is the belief, the really deep belief that every student can learn. That's what the idea of inclusion is about. It's not mixing everybody up. It's about believing that everybody can succeed, that everybody can learn, that it's up to me as a teacher to find the right path. And it's up to the school system to give people the resources. No? In the past, we treat everybody equally in the education system. That was the system of the industrial age. We just push students through this mill, and some will succeed, they were going to become the knowledge workers, and others are less successful, we make them to work for the knowledge workers. That was the industrial society, sorting in education. Then we began to advance to something that we call equity. And what I mean by equity is we pay more attention to who needs more resources. Formula-based funding is now actually in most countries becoming the norm. We invest more resources, more teachers for students from disadvantage. But the future is really about justice, where we remove the barriers, where we actually ensure that everybody can collaborate. In the industrial age, we could become equitable societies through redistribution. Now we could say basically, okay, you didn't do so well in education, we give you some basic salary or some money, and then you can still be happy and participate in society. Redistribution worked in the industrial age. In the age in which we live, it no longer works, because today to participate in society is not about money. No? You can give everybody money, but they cannot participate meaningfully in society without a good education. There is no equity in our societies without equity in education. It has become the foundation of success, and it's about removing barriers, not about distributing our resources just differently. And you can see when you look at this across countries, one of the most interesting data about, countries like Finland is not their high average performance on a test like PISA. It's the fact that only 5% of the performance variation lies between schools. Every school succeeds. And that is because every school knows what every other school has been doing. There is a strong sense of collaboration in the school system. If you're a school principal in Finland, you'd spend 2/3 of your time working for your school as a principal. But you spend also 1/3 of your time working in the government, in the municipality. And that's where you meet other school principals and work with other school principals to solve the problems of your school and the school system. The government or the administration is not a bureaucracy of people who know nothing about schooling. It's the people themselves who run their systems. As a school principal, you have responsibility for your school, but you also have responsibility for the school system. Go to the other end of the world, to China back. Teachers have a collaborative platform, a digital platform, where they can, present their ideas, their project, their lesson plans, so that other teachers can actually see it. And they do that. Why do they do that? Because it's combined with reputational metrics. The more other teachers are going to use your lessons, download your lessons, criticize your lessons, build on your lessons, the more famous you become in the school system, like in academia. And at the end of the school year, your principal will ask you not only how well did you teach the students in your school, but what contribution did you make to the education system? How are you regarded in the education system? What's your intellectual contribution to the education as a whole? And that is what limits performance variation, and it's so important. I come back to the fact that no education system can be better than its teachers. And I already mentioned, there's 3 factors. I want to remind you again. It's about the deep knowledge that students have about their subject, about how their students learn, and about their students as individuals. It's about professional autonomy, and it's about the collaborative culture. And we can actually, I want to just show you one piece of data on the collaborative culture, because we need to look at this in a very nuanced way. If you look actually at superficial collaboration, it's quite common. No? Teachers are very social people. They change materials, they sort of share resources, they talk about students, and so on. But if you look at the deeper level of collaboration, that really makes a difference. No? Classroom observation. No? Look, in most countries, it's only 1 in 10 teachers who regularly looks at another teacher's class. No? How can you learn about education without being regularly exposed? It's like learning a foreign language. The moment you learn your own language is when you learn a foreign language, when you start to see the world through different lenses and perspectives. And we don't give teachers enough of that opportunity. Professional collaborative development, no? Very rare, except in some countries. No? So the deep collaboration, really when I talk about professional collaboration, I'm not talking about teachers not being social and generous people. I'm talking at the opportunities schools provide for the kind of meaningful, deep exchange of experience. Now, why do I say this? Because I have data to show that the more teachers, teach jointly, the more they observe other teachers' classroom, the more they take part in collaborative professional development, the greater their sense of ownership of the profession, the greater their trust in their own abilities, the greater their job satisfaction. This is not a nice to have. Teacher-professional collaboration is the core of the future of the teaching profession, something really important. You can score countries on this, huge variability in this. It's actually interesting. If you look at the #1 system in teacher professionalism, Estonia, a relatively poor country, somewhere in the northeast of Europe. And the reason why they come out so well is because of their strong teacher professional autonomy. Teachers are really, really good, and they are creative designers and so on. If I look at Shanghai in China, the red bar is very small. Now, teachers can still grow in their professional autonomy, but what they are really, really good at, sharing, collaboration, learning from and with each other. So if you could combine the tradition of the Estonians of being great professionals and the tradition of the Chinese to be great, social teachers, you could create the world's best profession. So every education system has room and space to learn in this. Now, I bring you to something towards the end that is really hard to accept for us, and that's that teachers not always do what they say. I bring you some teachers from Britain here. When we ask British teachers, what it means to be a good teacher, they offer a very constructivist view on education. My students learn best when I'm a coach, a facilitator. Thinking and reasoning is more important than curriculum content. All of those kinds of things. The vast majority of British teachers have this kind of constructivist view of education. But if British teachers would do what they say, you would actually find that they would not use rote learning and memorization and those kinds of tools. But actually, when you look at the data, you can find the United Kingdom right out on the top when it comes to memorization. So there's a gap between what teachers think they do and what teachers actually do. How do we close this gap? By giving teachers better opportunities to see what they're actually doing. And actually, the countries at the bottom of the list are very different ones. What's also interesting, if I had asked you at the beginning, which are the countries that are, dominant on rote learning, many would always tip on countries like Korea or China or Singapore or Japan, the East Asian countries. But actually, you see, they have gone way beyond that. They used to do those kinds of things. But when the 21st century arrived, they started to do things differently, to put much greater emphasis on deep learning, on intrinsic motivation, on 21st century learning strategies. They have changed. In Europe, we have not. Basically continue what you do. So there are big, big differences in this. And why do I say this? Why this is important? This comes again from our PISA comparison. What I do here is basically the probability of getting a mathematics tasks right on the PISA test by the difficulty of the task. And what you can see is for relatively simple tasks, memorization is an effective strategy. Now, you can actually remember the correct answer for a simple mathematical problem. But what you also see for more complex mathematical problems, memorization hinders you finding the right answer. It's not only not neutral, that it would be at the zero line, is actually in the negative. If you have a problem in front of you that requires mathematical reasoning or mathematical modeling, and you try desperately to remember the correct answer, you will never find it. Actually, your attempt to memorize will prevent you from finding this solution. Why is this important in the 21st century? Because the world is moving very, very fast from the left to the right side. No? The kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to memorize, that are done very well by computers today, whereas the complex mathematical reasoning tasks, they are the ones where humans are important. No? And you can see when you ask yourself, what is good for learning outcomes, you can see it's what we call elaboration strategies. Your capacity to connect what you don't know with what you know. Your capacity to think lateral, to build connections between this. Now, this is the single most important predictor. And that's where the 21st century skills come back to the reality in our classrooms. So education systems with a heavy emphasis on rote learning, memorization, prepare students for our past, not for their future. Not everybody agrees with this. Now, you can see actually memorization can be a useful tool for simple tasks, but for the kind of things that are actually increasingly important, they're going to be actually less and less and less effective. The very last point I want to make is about the innovative capacity in our education systems. We ask teachers around the world, if you are more innovative in your teaching, will the system recognize you for this? Will the system reward innovation? And we had only about a quarter of teachers who said yes. 3/4 of the teachers saw their schools as an essentially innovation hostile environment. That may not be the truth, that may just be a perception. But if we cannot change that perception, it's going to be very hard to change anything. So things are really important. And of course, once again, things are easy to say, hard to do. And sometimes the kind of things that we talk about most, the structures, the resources, the class sizes, the kind of formal kind of issues, they are just a tiny tip of a huge iceberg in education. Why we see collisions is because we overlook the 90% that is under the waterline, and that is about the fears and motivations and ideas of people that we rarely see in education. We're very, very good in pushing new ideas into schools from the top. We're actually very, very bad to actually see the good ideas in the classrooms, in the schools, to be able to recognize those good ideas, to mobilize them, to share and to spread them. Now, that's what the future of education system is about. Even the best minister of education can no longer solve the problems of 10,000s of schools and 100,000s of teachers and millions of students. It's only when we're able to mobilize and share and spread the ideas that we find in the profession that we're going to change the school system. And that's, again, why I think your association is so important. Thank you very much. Grazie.